Dear ladies and gentlemen, before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers very warmly for the invitation and for making this conference possible. It is a real pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm also grateful for the opportunity to speak in such a wonderful and hospitable country, and I very much look forward to the discussions and dialogue that will follow during this conference. Let me begin with a short story told by Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, which, by the way, also can be found in Jainism. We visited a temple yesterday, and there we learned that. It is described that a group of people is entering a dark room where an elephant is standing. Because it is completely dark, no one can see the whole animal. Each person touches a different part. One touches the trunk and says, "It looks like a snake." Another one touches the leg and says, "No, this is a tree." A third touches the ear and insists, "It is a fan." Very quickly they begin arguing, passionately and sincerely, each convinced that their own perception is correct. In Jainism, this illustrates Anikantevada. It means that it is not mystical. It is a structural problem. Conflict does not arise because people are ill-intentioned. It arises because each person experiences only one fragment of reality and mistakes it for the whole. I begin with this story because many contemporary democracies increasingly resemble this dark room. Perception fragments, trust erodes, and coexistence becomes fragile. Before I continue, let me briefly explain how my analysis is structured. Given the limited time, I will focus on 7 core theses derived from my research and will not go into detail, but only briefly outline the main topics. This presentation is guided by 3 questions. First, how did endemic polarization in Turkey shape Hizmet's civic repertoire? Second, how did this repertoire travel and transform in the German institutional environment? And third, what challenges and potential emerge from this adaptation process for civil Islam and democratic resilience? My analysis draws on 4 main strands of social science: polarization research, civic repertoire theory, institutional adaptation, and transnational perspectives. Together, these approaches form the analytical foundation of the work. This presentation is only a short summary. It is not a comprehensive history of the movement, nor an exhaustive theoretical analysis. My aim is to highlight the most important issues concerning polarization, civic engagement, and democratic resilience today. Let me start with my first thesis. Polarization does not only undermine democracy, it also shapes kinds of civic practices that emerge. According to Jennifer McCoy, an American political scientist, it is crucial to distinguish between ideological and effective polarization. Ideological polarization concerns policy disagreement and is largely manageable. But effective polarization is different. Political opponents are seen as moral enemies. This erodes trust, undermines cooperation, and political opponents are seen as moral enemies. This erodes trust, undermines cooperation, weakens deliberation, and normalizes zero-sum logic, where compromise appears as betrayal. To understand this, let's have a look at Turkey, where Hizmet developed. Turkey illustrates what happens when polarization becomes persistent rather than episodic. Since the founding of the Republic in 1923, political life has been shaped by deep and overlapping conflicts between secular and religious identities, around the Kurdish question, through repeated military interventions, and through weak protection of minorities. These conflicts did not simply create disagreement. They institutionalized distrust. Repeated coups in 1960, 1971, 1980, and 1997 reinforced the belief that civilian politics was too dangerous to be trusted. Over time, polarization becomes structural rather than temporary. Political opponents were no longer seen as legitimate competitors, but as an existential threat, and compromise was seen as betrayal. Under these conditions, democratic norms erode, civil discourse deteriorates, the public sphere becomes more confrontational and less deliberative, and political competition slips into zero-sum logic. This, in turn, lowers the cost of authoritarian consolidation. Democratic institutions can be hollowed out without triggering broad cross-sectoral resistance. Hizmet had to experience this in Turkey for the last years, Armenians, Kurds, and Alevis, other minorities in Turkey, for much more years. In this sense, the Turkish trajectory offers a clear warning for Western democracies. It shows what can happen when effective polarization is left unattended too long. My second thesis follows directly this context. Hizmet emerged not as a political project, but as a civic response to polarization. Hizmet has chosen the way of a civil Islam and not the way of political Islam, like other Muslim actors did in Turkey. Thus, beginning in the late 1960s, Hizmet developed a repertoire based on three pillars: education, dialogue, and service. I won't go into details since this is already topic of other presentations. Importantly, these practices did not seek political power. They sought cooperation in an environment where politics was perceived as dangerous. In this sense, Hizmet reflects what Max Weber described as an ethic of responsibility, in acting in ways that preserve social cohesion even under adverse political conditions. My third thesis is bridge building is an alternative civic logic of Hizmet. This slide illustrates just how broad Hizmet's bridge building efforts were in Turkey across different contexts. One image shows the Mosque Cemevi project, a joint worship and community center created to bring Sunni and Alevi communities in the same space for shared prayer and for social interaction. Another picture shows Gülen meeting with artists, public figures, and politicians. You see the pictures of Fethullah Gülen with religious leaders and with leaders of different minorities. A series of conferences and forums dealt with topics that were often ignored in the mainstream political sphere, such as the relationship between Islam and democracy, religion and politics, freedom of expression and freedom of speech, or human rights, or, for example, the cultural and political rights of Kurds. The tutoring center pictured in the bottom row was located in the southeastern Turkey and was established to give Kurdish children academic support and opportunities that might keep them from being drawn into the PKK's terrorist violence. Together, these images represent only a small selection of the movement's activities. They exemplify Hizmet's strategy of cheating diverse civic platforms that cross ideological, religious, and ethnic boundaries. Taken together, these initiatives generated what Robert Putnam famously called bridging social capital, social ties that connect groups rather than reinforce divisions. My fourth thesis may sound counterintuitive to you. Repressions did weaken Hizmet, yes, but it also transformed and expanded its civic capacities. From 2013 onward, and especially after 2016, Hizmet faced systematic repression in Turkey. Many members were forced into exile. This diaspora phase brought about several important changes. First, the movement began to modernize. Members developed new skills in advocacy, public communication, research, and coalition building. For example, with other minorities in Turkey, like Kurds, Alevis, or other groups. Second, self-definition became unavoidable. Identity and mission could no longer be taken for granted and had to be clearly articulated. We see this, for example, in the Hizmet values document that was presented in the panel just before. And third, alliances become essential. Dialogue was no longer mainly symbolic, it became a form of protection. And here, Hannah Arendt's insight is very relevant. Power emerges from the ability to act in concert. In exile, acting in concert across religious and civic boundaries became a condition of survival. My fifth thesis brings me to Europe and Germany and their polarization context. The map on this slide illustrates how widespread authoritarian populist sentiment has become across the continent. It ranks countries by the percentage of voters who expressed authoritarian populist views. According to these figures, we see Romania, Poland, followed by France, the Netherlands, and Finland. Sweden, Spain, and Germany have comparatively lower levels, but the picture underscores that no Western democracy is immune from this trend. In presenting this data, my point is not to demonize any specific country, but to contextualize the rise of populist and authoritarian ideologies across Europe. This helps explain why discussions about democratic resilience and the role of civil actors like Hizmet have become more urgent, especially in countries where trust in democratic institutions is relatively fragile and populist ideas have gained traction. As I said, Germany is not immune to the forces reshaping politics across Europe. In recent years, we have seen growing support for populist parties, most notably the AfD, along with an increase in identity-based conflicts and the rise of digital echo chambers that amplify extreme views. At the same time, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are on the rise, and public trust in political parties is declining. The bar graph on the slide captures the social consequences of this escalating polarization. Taken together, these trends point to the social consequences of growing polarization. While Germany's situation is not yet comparable to the Turkish experience, the pattern of fragmentation is familiar and resembles its early stages. This raises an important question. How can civic initiatives like Hizmet intervene early to strengthen democratic resilience before polarization becomes deeply entrenched? My sixth thesis is the turn of Hizmet in Germany to German. After 2016, Germany became more and more important for Hizmet. This was enabled by Germany's constitutional protections, strong civil society, and post-migrant social structure. Over time, Hizmet evolved from informal initiatives into foundations, platforms, and professional networks. A large, well-educated migration wave significantly expanded civic capacity. But from the first day in the 80s, Hizmet had to face different challenges. Informal organization habits with expectations of transparency, low visibility, limited public recognition, Turkey-centric framing persisted. But this is all changing quickly. My last and seventh thesis is Hizmet's importance in Germany lies in its civic relevance and democratic resilience. Despite these challenges, Hizmet's relevance in Germany lies in its non-political civic contribution. It fosters bridge-building social capital, interreligious cooperation, civic education, humanitarian engagement, and a form of civil Islam that treats faith as a civic resource rather than a political project. Initiatives such as the House of One in Berlin exemplify this approach. The House of One is an interfaith project that brings a church, a synagogue, and a mosque together under one roof with shared spaces for dialogue and community life. It represents not ideology, but shared infrastructure, creating everyday encounters rather than symbolic gestures. Maybe like it was aimed with the now destroyed Jami Mosque Cemevi project that was destroyed in Ankara by the regime. I come to my conclusion, and I will briefly summarize the key findings of the analysis. First, the Hizmet case demonstrates that sustained polarization does not simply suppress civic engagement. It shapes it into different forms. In Turkey, polarization encouraged a civic repertoire centered on education, dialogue, service, and institutional pragmatism, practices designed to preserve cooperation in a hostile political environment. Second, Hizmet's relocation to Germany shows that such repertoires are not automatically transferable. They require institutional translation through legal formalization, transparency, public self-definition, and coalition building beyond the own diaspora. While this adaptation process involved friction, it also expanded Hizmet's civic capacity within a liberal democratic setting. Third, Hizmet illustrates how a faith-based civic actor grounded in Islamic ethics, yet firmly committed to pluralism and democracy, can contribute to social cohesion without pursuing political power. Its strength lies in bridge building, interreligious cooperation, and civic education, rather than political mobilization or confrontation. The key take-home message is democratic resilience depends not only on institutions and laws, but on civic actors like Hizmet that are able to translate ethical commitments into durable, non-confrontational infrastructures of cooperation, especially in societies facing growing polarization. As Max Weber famously put it, politics is the slow boring of hard boards, but civil society helps to ensure that those boards do not break under pressure. And this is what Hizmet is trying to do. Thank you very much.